The text message came in at 2:47 in the afternoon while I was sitting in a paper gown on a cold exam table, waiting for my oncologist to come back with the results I already knew weren't good. My husband's name lit up the screen. I thought he was checking in on me. He knew what today was. I'd reminded him 3 times that morning, even packed his lunch so he wouldn't have to think about anything except maybe sending a prayer my way. The message said, "I filed the paperwork. My attorney will be in contact. I'm sorry it came to this." That was it. No phone call, no explanation. 14 words to end 6 years of marriage. I'm Maren Cole. I'm 31 years old. I have stage 2 breast cancer, a joint checking account that was about to get a lot lighter, and apparently a husband who'd been planning this for longer than I'd been planning my treatment. Dr. Searle. Okonkwo came back in while I was still staring at the phone. She looked at my face and immediately set down her clipboard. "What happened?" she asked. And she meant the message, not the test results. The test results, I already knew. The treatment would be aggressive. We'd talk about port placement, about whether I wanted to bank embryos before chemo, about what the next 18 months of my life would look like. My husband had chosen today. Of all the days on the calendar, the morning after my biopsy confirmed what the mammogram suggested. Today, my husband just filed for divorce, I said. I was surprised by how flat my voice sounded, like I was reading a grocery list. Eggs, milk. My marriage is over. Dr. Okonkwo sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have someone who can drive you home?" I did not. I called my younger sister Petra, who I hadn't spoken to properly in almost a year. We'd had a falling out over our dad's estate, something that seemed incredibly petty sitting on that exam table in a paper gown. And she picked up on the second ring. I told her 2 things. The diagnosis first, then the text message. There was a long silence. Then she said, "I'm leaving right now. Do not move." I sat in the parking lot of the oncology office for 40 minutes waiting for her and did what I suspect a lot of women in crisis do. I opened Instagram, my husband's account. He'd been boasting lately about new energy and growth and becoming the version of myself I was always meant to be. I'd assumed it was the gym phase, the protein shake phase, the 5 a.m. cold plunge phase that had started about 6 months ago when he suddenly cared very deeply about his cortisol levels. There she was. A woman tagged in 3 of his recent posts, someone named Kelsey with a fitness brand, and a very particular way of standing next to my husband, like she was measuring him for curtains. She'd been in his comments for months. I'd noticed her once and felt nothing because I trusted him. I actually genuinely trusted him. The most recent photo was from 2 days ago, both of them at a rooftop bar I'd never been to. He was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in probably 2 years. I closed the app and stared at the windshield. The thing about being in the middle of a cancer diagnosis is that you don't have room to fall apart about everything at once. Your brain picks the most urgent emergency and locks in. I decided the most urgent emergency was not my husband. The most urgent emergency was the port placement, the insurance, and making sure I still had coverage when chemo started. I called our insurance provider from the parking lot. I explained the situation. Newly diagnosed, in active treatment planning, wanted to confirm my coverage status before anything changed. The representative put me on hold for 11 minutes. When she came back, her voice had shifted into a very careful, very deliberate register. "Mrs. Binitz, Cole, according to the separation filing date your husband submitted, your spousal coverage was terminated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. I had been attending pre-op appointments for 6 weeks. I had a surgery 3 weeks ago. I had lab work done last Tuesday. All of it theoretically uncovered." "That's not possible," I said. "We were not separated 6 weeks ago." "Ma'am, the paperwork indicates—" "The paperwork is fraudulent," I said. "I was living in our shared home 6 weeks ago. I have mail. I have bank records. I have grocery receipts from our joint account dated last week. I need you to open an investigation." Another pause. "Then, I'm going to transfer you to our fraud department." Petro arrived and found me in the parking lot, phone wedged between my ear and shoulder, pen in hand, writing down a case number. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out how broken they actually are. I held up one finger. "Let me finish this." Here's what my husband did not know about me. What most people don't know because I've never been someone who led with credentials. My name is Maren Cole, and I'm a licensed forensic examiner who spent the last 6 years working insurance fraud investigations for a regional firm before going independent 18 months ago. I find hidden assets. I document financial crimes. I have personally been responsible for 14 fraud prosecutions in the last 3 years. My husband had just committed insurance fraud by filing a backdated separation with our provider. He'd done it while I was undergoing active cancer screening, which under federal law created additional exposure because of the ADA adjacent protections around health coverage during treatment. He thought he was leaving a sick wife. He had no idea what he'd married. Petra drove me home. I sat in the passenger seat with a legal pad and started making columns. What I knew, what I needed to find, what was already evidence. You're not going to cry, she asked. Not yet, I said. When? After the injunction. Before we continue, if you're finding this story gripping, please subscribe to Her Veiled Heart and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means more than you know. The morning after my diagnosis, 3 things happened in quick succession. First, I checked our joint account. $38,000. I did a screenshot. Then I transferred half to a new account in my name alone, which I was legally entitled to do as a joint account holder, and called our bank to flag unusual activity on the remaining balance. The banker, a quiet man named Gerald who sounded like he'd heard everything, said, "You're smart to do this now." Then he told me quietly that there had been 3 large cash withdrawals over the past 6 weeks, a total of $9,000, gone in increments small enough to not trigger automatic alerts. Second, I called Vera, my best friend from law school, who was now a very good divorce attorney in our city. She'd been texting me since the diagnosis. She showed up at my house by 9 in the morning with coffee, a tote bag full of files, and an expression I recognized from every deposition I'd ever sat across from her in. "Walk me through everything," she said. By noon, she had enough for an emergency motion. Third, my mother-in-law called. My husband's mother, Constance, who had never been anything but polite to me and who I suspected had always loved me in the careful, restrained way of someone who didn't want to show favoritism. She was crying before I said hello. "I saw what he did," she said. "I want you to know I didn't know. And I want you to know I have his father's financial records going back 15 years, and I think you need to see them." I told her to come over. This is the part I need to explain because it matters to everything that came after. My husband's father, a man I'd met exactly 4 times, who left Constance when their son was 9 years old, had done something very similar. Taken money slowly, filed paperwork with backdated dates, moved in with someone else while Constance was dealing with a health crisis of her own. She'd never had the resources to fight it properly. She'd lost the house. She sat at my kitchen table with a manila folder and spread out documents from a divorce that happened 22 years ago and said, "I thought I'd raised him differently." "I'm so sorry," I told her. She hadn't failed. Her son had failed. And then I told her that I was going to need her to remember everything because pattern evidence in financial misconduct cases is more useful than most people realize. She nodded. Then she said, "He has a storage unit I pay for. Has for 3 years. He told me it was for his camping gear." I looked at Vera. Vera looked at me. "Do you have the unit number?" Vera asked. The storage unit was in my mother-in-law's name because, my husband had explained, the one near his work didn't take cards and he needed to put it under a name with auto pay. Constance had never questioned it. Why would she? He was her son. The contents, as documented by the storage facility manager when Vera arrived with a notarized letter from Constance authorizing access, were not camping gear. There were boxes, financial documents, a second laptop, and this is the part that still staggers me, a folder of printed paperwork that included a forged letter from a physician stating that I had been advised not to pursue aggressive cancer treatment and had declined further care. He had forged a letter about my medical decisions. In a divorce proceeding, that kind of document would affect custody if we'd had children and asset decisions, creating the impression that my prognosis was worse than disclosed. It would also affect insurance settlement calculations. Vera photographed everything. She called our insurance fraud investigator from the parking lot of the storage facility. The investigator, a woman named Priya, who I'd actually worked with twice in a professional capacity, picked up immediately. Maren, she said, what did he do? I told her about the forged medical letter. There was a pause. Then, that's federal, we know. My husband, meanwhile, was apparently living his best life. Kelsey, whose last name I now knew, whose LLC I had already run through the state business registry, whose tax filings I had pulled, was posting daily. Morning runs, green smoothies, a photo of her in what I recognized as my kitchen, standing at my counter using my KitchenAid, caption living in my dream space. She'd moved in apparently within 4 days of my husband filing. 4 days. She was wearing my grandmother's bracelet in one of the photos, a thin gold cuff my grandmother had left me specifically, that I kept in the top drawer of my dresser because I wore it on good days, and this year hadn't had many. Petra saw it before I did. She sent me a screenshot with a single message. Is that yours? I looked at it for a long time. Then I texted my mother-in-law and asked her to meet me at the house the following morning. I want to tell you what I was like during all of this, because I think it matters. I was not performing calm. I was not white-knuckling it through some stoic revenge fantasy. I was genuinely deeply dissociating in the way that happens when your body and your brain hit their limit, and your nervous system just decides to go clinical. I had a cancer diagnosis. I had a treatment plan starting in 11 days. I had a fraudulent divorce filing, a forged medical document, a depleted joint account, and a husband who'd moved a woman into my house. My oncology nurse, a woman named Bethany, who had seen everything and was not impressed by anything, came for my first home visit to go over port care protocols and found me at my kitchen table with 3 laptops open and a color-coded spreadsheet of transaction records. Your blood pressure is going to be a problem, she said. My husband is going to be a worse problem, I said. She took my blood pressure. It was high but not alarming. She looked at the spreadsheets. What are you building? A prosecution, I said. She nodded slowly. Okay. Can you do this lying down? Because you should really be lying down. I moved to the couch. She propped up my feet. I kept working. The financial picture, as it developed, was a masterclass in what happens when someone believes that because they handled all the household accounting, they are the only one who understands money. My husband had been siphoning from our joint savings for 11 months. Small amounts, always. Never over $2,000 at a time. He'd been depositing them into an account I didn't know existed, a credit union account opened in his name only 14 months ago. 14 months ago. We'd been talking about starting a family 14 months ago. He'd been enthusiastic. He'd suggested names. The account had $41,000 in it. He'd also been running personal expenses through his business account, a small consulting firm he'd started 3 years ago. By classifying Kelsey's gym memberships, her car lease payments, and a weekend trip to Charleston as client entertainment and professional development. The client, when I ran the name through business registration records, did not exist. I had seen this exact scheme 11 times in my professional career. Usually it took people months to unravel. I had it documented in 4 days because I did this for a living and because fury, it turns out, is an excellent motivator. Vera filed the counter motion on a Thursday. The emergency injunction froze all marital assets, flagged the fraudulent separation date, and included a request for sanctions based on the forged medical document. She also forwarded the complete file to Priya's supervisor, who forwarded it to the Federal Fraud Division, because using fraudulent medical documentation in an insurance filing is not a state-level offense. My husband called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. Third call I picked up. We need to talk about what you're doing, he said. He sounded less like a man who'd filed for divorce and more like a man who just realized the fire he'd set had turned around. I said, send it through your attorney. Maren? Your attorney, I said. Have a good night. His attorney called Vera the next morning. Vera told me about it over the phone and she was laughing, which was not something Vera did professionally. His attorney, a man she'd dealt with before, had apparently opened the call with, my client is concerned there may have been a misunderstanding. Vera had said, about which felony. The next 2 weeks moved in a particular rhythm. CHEMO prep in the mornings, labs, port flushes, the slow bureaucratic machinery of treatment scheduling, evidence building in the afternoons. Bettany came every other day and had stopped being surprised by the legal documents on my coffee table. She'd started asking questions. "What's a forensic trace report?" she asked one afternoon. I explained it. She nodded. "So you can prove where money went even if someone tries to hide it?" "Yes." "Wild," she said, and took my temperature. Priya's team had expanded the investigation. The forged physician letter had led them to a second forged document, a letter, allegedly from my therapist, stating that I had expressed suicidal ideation and was considered an unstable party in financial matters. He built a paper trail designed to make me look incompetent and irrational, presumably so that in any asset dispute, my judgment could be questioned. My actual therapist, when informed, used language I had never heard her use before. The federal investigator who contacted me was named Agent Reyes. Wait, I can't use that name. She'd already appeared in another file. Let me say only that the federal investigator was a woman, calm and precise, who told me on a recorded call that in her 12 years of financial fraud investigation, the combination of offenses my husband had assembled was, in her words, genuinely impressive in the worst possible way. "People usually stop at 2 or 3, she said. He went for the full set. He had, at this point, accumulated insurance fraud, wire fraud, forgery of medical documents, identity fraud for signing my name on the backdated separation acknowledgement, financial fraud through the fictitious business client, and fraudulent misrepresentation in a legal proceeding. Each one of these was a separate charge. Several crossed state lines because his fake business client was registered in a different state. Constance came to every one of my chemo infusion days. She sat in the chair beside me and brought things, good tea, not the terrible stuff from the hospital cart, audiobooks she downloaded based on a list I gave her, a small weighted blanket because the infusion suite was always cold. She didn't try to talk through everything. She just sat there, and sometimes we talked about nothing, about the audiobook, about the woman across the suite who was knitting a sweater and making remarkable progress. "I should have seen it earlier," she said one afternoon. "You saw it now," I said. "He's going to lose everything." "He already has." Kelsey, for her part, was not a villain in the way I'd initially cast her. She was 24 and had genuinely believed what my husband told her, that I'd left, that we'd been separated for over a year, that the house was effectively his. When the injunction was served and she realized she was living in a home that was subject to court order, she called Vera directly. Not him, Vera. She was cooperative to a degree that surprised everyone. She had texts. She had voicemails. She had screenshots of documents he'd sent her explaining why he needed to move fast before I complicated the process. She handed over everything. She also quietly returned my grandmother's bracelet. She left it in a small envelope on the porch with a handwritten note that said only, "I'm sorry." I didn't know this was hers. I put the bracelet back where it belonged and I did not feel generous about it in the moment, but I did not feel rage either. She'd been lied to. She'd been used as a prop in a scheme she didn't understand. 24 is young enough to be that stupid and still have time to recover. My husband did not have that excuse. The court date was set for a Tuesday in October. I had finished my 3rd round of chemo. My hair was starting to go and I'd cut it short in anticipation, which my sister helped me with in the bathroom mirror one Saturday morning, both of us crying a little and then laughing about it, which is how grief works when you have someone to share it with. I walked into that courtroom in a blazer and my grandmother's bracelet. Vera walked in beside me. Constance sat behind us in the gallery. Peter was beside her. My husband arrived with his attorney and a rental suit he'd clearly borrowed at the last minute. He looked like a man who'd had a very bad month. Which he had, objectively, because Kelsey had moved back to her parents' house. His consulting clients had quietly scattered after word got out about the fictitious client investigation, and his credit cards had been frozen pending the fraud inquiry. He was not having a good time. The judge was a woman in her late 50s who reviewed the case file before the hearing and had apparently done a great deal of that reviewing because she arrived at the bench looking like someone who had made up her mind and was here to confirm it. She went through the charges methodically, the backdated separation, The forged documents, the fictitious insurance filing during active cancer treatment, the hidden account, the siphoned savings, the fraudulent business expenses. My husband's attorney tried, twice, to suggest that there had been miscommunications, that my husband had acted under stress, that the forged medical letter had been a mistake in judgment during an emotional period. The judge looked at him with an expression I recognized from my own career. It was the expression of someone who had not come here for excuses. Your client, she said, forged a physician's letter about a woman undergoing cancer treatment in order to misrepresent her mental and physical capacity in a legal proceeding. That is not a miscommunication. That is not an emotional period. That is deliberate and documented fraud. My husband's attorney said nothing. The defense rests, he said quietly. The settlement was complete. The house was mine. The down payment had come from my inheritance from my grandmother, documented clearly. The hidden account, all $41,000, was to be returned in full with interest. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed, at his insistence, because he'd been worried about my earning potential in forensic work, included a clause about financial misconduct. It had seemed like a strange thing to include at the time. Vera had advised me to sign it without overthinking it. That clause was now worth $175,000. The criminal charges were handled separately. The federal counts, wire fraud, insurance fraud, forgery of federal documents, carried significant exposure. The plea agreement his attorney negotiated after several weeks of back and forth was 4 years federal, 2 years supervised release, full restitution, and a permanent bar from working in financial services. When the officers prepared to take him into custody, he turned and looked at me from across the courtroom. I looked back. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need a final line. Petra said later that she'd never seen me look so still. 6 months after the verdict, the rhythm of my life looked nothing like what I'd planned, and everything like what I needed. I was in active remission, not clear yet, it was too early for that word, but moving in the right direction. Bethany, who had followed my case with the intensity of a true crime podcast listener, celebrated with me at my last infusion by bringing a very small cake that said "done" for now on it, which was exactly the right level of realistic optimism. My forensic practice had grown in a direction I hadn't anticipated. Vera had started referring clients to me, specifically women whose spouses were contesting assets, claiming poverty, restructuring businesses conveniently during divorces. Women who needed someone who understood both the financial architecture and the human behavior underneath it. I'd hired an associate, a sharp young man named Elliot, who had a gift for spotting shell companies, and a part-time paralegal who handled intake so I could focus on the actual work. Constance and I had Thursday coffee, which had started as a logistical check-in during the legal proceedings and had quietly become a fixed point in both our weeks. She was rebuilding her relationship with herself, she told me once, which I understood because she'd spent so many years in the shadow of what her son had done and what his father had done before him. You broke the pattern, she told me one morning. You helped, I said. You did the hard part. Petra and I had repaired what broke between us over our father's estate with the particular efficiency of people who've watched each other survive something real. The estate documents still sat in a box in my office. We'd decided to deal with them eventually, when the word eventually felt less heavy. The letter from Kelsey came in early spring. It was handwritten, which I appreciated more than I expected. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't explain herself. She said only that she was in therapy, that she'd been doing a lot of thinking, and that she understood now what she'd been complicit in, even without meaning to be. She'd taken a job as an administrative coordinator at a women's health nonprofit and was trying, as she put it, to be someone worth being. I wrote back. Short but honest. I told her I didn't hold her responsible for what she didn't know. I told her the bracelet was back where it belonged. I told her that 24 is young enough to still become who you want to be. I meant all of it. My husband's letters from federal custody, I returned unopened, but not before Vera photographed the postmarks and added them to the ongoing restitution file. He had sent 9. I had returned 9. At some point, I assumed he would stop. The case was used as a training example in a continuing education seminar for insurance fraud investigators. Priya called to tell me sounding quietly delighted. The presenter had anonymized the names, but the outline of it was unmistakable. Hidden account, backdated filing, forged medical documentation, fictitious business entity. Someone in the seminar audience had apparently raised their hand and said, "What kind of person tries all of this at once?" The presenter had said, "A very arrogant one." On a Tuesday in November, I got a call from a woman, 33 years old, 7 months pregnant, whose husband had just cleared out their savings and served her divorce papers at her OB appointment. She'd found me through Vera. Her voice was shaking the way voices shake when the brain hasn't caught up to what's happened yet. I said, "I know exactly what you're going through, and I need you to listen to me. The first thing you're going to do is take a screenshot of your account balances right now before anything else moves. Can you do that?" She could. "Good," I said. Now here's what comes next. I work with 3 clients like her every month now. Women who find me after the document, the text, the email, the moment their life rearranges itself in the time it takes to read a screen. Women who have been made to feel like the vulnerable one. Women who have no idea what they're actually capable of when someone hands them a reason to find out. My husband thought a cancer diagnosis made me a soft target. He had 6 years of evidence to the contrary and never looked at any of it. That, in the end, is what I keep coming back to. Not the fraud, or the accounts, or the forged letters, or the 4 years of federal time. Just the fundamental miscalculation of thinking that a woman in a paper gown waiting for bad news is a woman who has given up. I hadn't given up. I'd been gathering information. And when the moment came, I knew exactly what to do with it. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. More stories are waiting for you on this channel. Click one now. I promise you won't want to stop. People ask me sometimes what kept me steady through all of it. The diagnosis, the text message, the forged letters, the mornings I sat on my couch with the port in my chest and the laptop open, building a case against the man I'd made a life with. And I never quite know how to answer that in a way that sounds true rather than rehearsed. So I usually just say, I knew what I was looking at. I'd spent years learning to see exactly what people try to hide. And once you have that skill, you can't unknow it. You just decide what to do with it. What I've come to understand, sitting on the other side of all of it, is that my husband's biggest mistake wasn't the fraud or the hidden account or even the forged medical letter, though all of those were spectacular failures of both ethics and judgment. His biggest mistake was the assumption underneath all of it. The assumption that vulnerability is the same thing as weakness. That a woman receiving a cancer diagnosis in a paper gown is a woman who has run out of fight. He looked at the hardest moment of my life and saw an opportunity. And that tells you everything about who he is, and nothing at all about who I am. Constance figured this out before I did, I think. She'd lived through a version of this story once already, without the resources to fight back, and she carried that with her for 20 years. When she sat beside me at those infusion appointments, she wasn't just being kind. She was doing the thing she'd never gotten to do the first time around. She was watching someone refuse to lose. That mattered to her in a way I didn't fully understand until much later, when she told me that she'd spent a long time believing she'd failed because she hadn't been strong enough. I had to tell her that strength isn't something you either have or you don't. It's something you build slowly, from the things that tried to break you. She'd built it. She'd just spent 20 years not knowing where to put it. Petra and I talk about this sometimes now, what it means to show up for someone when showing up is inconvenient. She drove 40 minutes to sit with me in a parking lot because I needed a ride home. That was it. That was the whole thing. And from that afternoon forward, she didn't leave. I think about the year we spent not speaking over something that, in the end, was just 2 grieving people being small with each other. I don't want to waste time being small anymore. Life is genuinely too short and too uncertain for that. What I want to say to anyone watching this who recognizes something in my story, maybe not the fraud, maybe not the cancer, but that specific feeling of being left at your lowest point by someone who was supposed to stay, is this: the lowest point is not the end of your story. It is, if you let it be, the place where you find out exactly what you're made of. Not because suffering is noble or because hardship builds character in some tidy, predictable way, but because when everything else is stripped away, you find out what remains. And what remains is you, your mind, your training, your relationships, your ability to think clearly under pressure. Those things belong to you. Nobody can file paperwork to take them away. My husband thought he knew my limits. He was wrong. And I think about Vera, who showed up with coffee and a tote full of files at 9 in the morning. And I think about Constance with her weighted blanket and her good tea. And I think about Petra cutting my hair in the bathroom mirror, and both of us crying and then laughing. And I think that is what actually wins. Not rage, not revenge exactly. Just the stubborn, unglamorous decision to keep going, to keep thinking, and to trust the people who stay. He chose the wrong moment to underestimate me. I am glad he did.